Thursday, February 25th, 2015, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my Missouri School of Journalism colleagues, Earnest Perry and Judd Slivka. On our program this week, on the heels of all of that reporting about vaccines and illnesses that may or may not have been tied to them, the Toronto Star pulls its report connecting the HPV vaccine Gardasil with certain illnesses in women. We'll look at the new way editors are pitching page one stories at the New York Times, and a look at the journalism job market. Surveys show some of our students might have a hard time come May. We'll talk about what we're seeing here and whether it matches the data. But I want to start today's show with another Views of the News rewind. Remember a few weeks ago we were talking about Brian Williams and media types coming to his defense? I played you this clip of Bill O'Reilly on the Jimmy Kimmel Show.
I could see that when you come on a show like Kimmel or any of the late night shows, you don't want to be a dweeb, all right? You want to have something interesting to say. And that's what happens, is that a journalist will say, okay, I was there, and then this story, to make it more dramatic and interesting, will emerge.
Right.
And that's what he did. He embellished the story. Now, if it's just one time, he'll get by. But if it's a pattern of this, it's going to be hard for him to come back and be the main anchor on NBC.
Interesting, yeah. Well, I think that's interesting that you have compassion for him. And
look, every public person in this country is a target. And with the internet, and you know what it is, it's a sewer. And these people delight in seeing famous people being taken apart. And I just think it's wrong.
At the time, we kind of shrugged our shoulders and said that O'Reilly had a bit of a point, that you don't want to be a dweeb, that you want to have a story to tell and one that's interesting, having something to say. That comment about it happening once being okay, but after that, well, a comeback would be hard. Little did we know, 2 weeks later, we'd be talking about a Mother Jones article headlined, Bill O'Reilly has his own Brian Williams problem. In it, reporters David Korn and David Schulman claim O'Reilly told war stories about his time covering the conflict between the UK and Argentina back in the 80s, stories they say don't stand up to scrutiny. Here's one clip that they point to.
Right. Because I was in a situation one time in a war zone in Argentina in the Falklands where my photographer got run down and hit his head and was bleeding from the ear on the concrete, and the army was chasing us. I had to make a decision, and I dragged them off, but at the same time I'm looking around and trying to do my job, but I figured I had to get this guy out of there because that was more important.
According to some of O'Reilly's then CBS colleagues, this isn't possible, that no American journalist made it to those locales. And among the most outspoken of them, Missouri School of Journalism alum and former KFRU news director Eric Enberg. Here he is on CNN's Reliable Sources.
Is Bill O'Reilly lying when he describes this combat situation?
Well, I think that what he's doing is he's trying to build it up into a more frightening and deadly situation than it was. It wasn't a combat situation by any sense of the word that I know. There were no people killed. He said that he saw troops fire into the crowd. I never saw that, and I don't know anybody who did. And I was there on the scene. What's interesting is, not only did I not hear any shots, I didn't see any ambulances, I didn't see any tanks, I didn't see any armored cars, all of the things that you would have expected to see had people been shot.
So let me start by asking the two of you, what do we know and what's still a gray area here?
It seems like we know that truth is stranger than fiction, or maybe fiction is stranger than truth. What we know is that 7 of O'Reilly's colleagues have said it wasn't quite that way, and that O'Reilly has responded by turning up the volume and swinging back.
I mean, I think part of the problem here is that we're sort of in this tit for tat thing. I mean, first you have the Brian Williams episode, and now all of a sudden you've got other journalists checking on other journalists. So it's sort of we're in this tell-all phase about whether or not a story is true or a story is not true. And O'Reilly has taken to the airwaves to basically defend himself and say, I'm going to hold to my story, and you guys can say whatever you want to say. So you've got former CBS colleagues saying we didn't see any of this, and he's saying, look, this is my story. Who you gonna believe, me or them? And that's basically what you have right now.
So who do you believe?
Well, I mean, the problem is that O'Reilly has created this sort of persona of himself of protecting his mantle. Some would say it's conservative mantle, it's the right mantle, but I believe it's him, his persona, regardless of whether you lean right or you lean left. And I think he's going to do whatever he needs to do in order to protect his brand. And if that means he's going to basically say that this is the left wing or mainstream media coming after me because of some of the things that I've done to them, and use that as a way to protect himself, then that's what he's going to do. But I'm not surprised by the tack that he's taking. But then also I'm not surprised by those of his former CBS colleagues who are saying, wait a minute, but this is the truth as we saw it at the time. So we feel like we have more of more truth on our side than you have on yours.
I don't think that this is new. If we look back, Johnny Apple with the New York Times was always accused of exaggerating what happened in battles during the Vietnam War. It's a famous story where he said, North Vietnamese bullet went right through the seat of my pants. And no one ever found the pants. He said, I threw them out because they were garbage. And every journalist who was there said, no one would do that. You'd keep the pants as a souvenir. So I don't think that this is anything new. I think that, as Ernest alludes to, we're in this cycle of gotcha. But I also think that O'Reilly has done a really good job of positioning himself as, I'm against the mainstream media. He's not saying, look, I'm right and you're wrong. What he's doing is he's calling the people who are accusing him, he's calling them gutter snipes and cowards. And
what is a gutter snipe exactly? Do we know?
I think it's something that he
just made up.
Well,
and that's also indicative of what his fighting back style kind of has been through this whole thing. The idea of, if I just scream louder, that's going to make me more right.
No, it's ad hominem attacks. And if I swing back and I portray this and I'm addressing my audience, because he doesn't care what we think, it will pay off, and it has. They've had higher ratings the last few nights than they've had in a long time.
And basically, that's because now he has something to fight against. There's not been a whole lot of news coming out lately, and a lot of it has been sort of to their advantage. They don't have the antagonist on the other side. So now he has the antagonist, and it is his former colleagues and those who say, hey, you've had your own Brian Williams moment, and Fox News needs to come out and sanction you in a similar fashion that NBC sanctioned Brian Williams. Well, that's not going to happen because Fox News is a separate entity, and it doesn't play by those same rules that NBC does.
So along those same lines, Sunday, Baltimore Sun media critic David Zurowick said that he kind of agrees with what you're saying right there, Ernest, that the situation is different than it was with Brian Williams. Here he is on Fox News Channel's Media Buzz.
Bill O'Reilly is the most popular person on cable news TV, but it's a nighttime show that has a very different agenda, and no one in cable TV, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, says these are journalistic entities. So there's a difference right there.
So difference right there. If you are putting, for those who are putting this on the same platform, at the same level as what happened with Brian Williams, by 5 or 6 days in, Brian Williams had already been removed from the anchor desk. This investigation was underway. Things were moving forward. We're not seeing those charges, if you will, sticking in the same way here. Is that about the personality versus the anchor of the evening news?
I think it's the personality, but I also think it's the person himself. I mean, Bill O'Reilly is a pundit. And he basically says that this is what I do. I comment on the news. I comment on newsmakers. Brian Williams, on the other hand, he's a news anchor. His role was to present the news in a, shall we say, balanced approach. And when he did that at 5:30 and during the elections and during war coverage and weather coverage and that sort of thing, he's presenting that as these are the facts, and I'm sort of acting as sort of an anchor in moving the news around. O'Reilly is a commenter. He's a pundit, and he's giving his opinion, and that's two totally separate situations.
I think that there's a cultural difference, too. I think that Fox has, for a long time, had a somewhat easier-going attitude when it came to opinions, when it's come to some of the accuracy of facts, even across their newscasts. And there's been studies that that have shown this too. And I think that Fox's culture is more tolerant of that because of its viewership than NBC's.
Okay. Well, all of us have spent a pretty good deal of time in newspaper newsrooms, and I don't know about you guys, but one of my favorite times of the day was being in the Page One meeting, when editors would pitch their reporters' best stories and fight for space on the front page. Sometimes those discussions could get pretty heated as editors tried to balance the news of the day, which stories would have the best photos or art to go with them, and so on. Well, New York Times editor Dean Baquet is ditching the traditional Page One meeting for something new, something he's calling the Dean's List. How is this going to work?
It strangely, I think, is the answer. The Dean's List is going to be what's the best story for our digital real estate across our apps, across our sites, and the mechanics of what goes on the front page the next morning is going to be dealt with at a later afternoon meeting where its importance has been de-emphasized. I think you're seeing the evolution of the New York Times from the old gray lady who comes out every morning to a newer gray lady who reinvents herself 3-4 times a day.
And in some ways, I think this is something that they've been doing for a while now. I mean, because a lot of people get their news and information from their app on their phone or on their tablet, or it comes in their computer through their email on a daily basis. So what they see there is not necessarily everything that they see in the New York Times that is thrown on your front doorsteps. I think they're just taking this one step further by saying we're going to spend more time looking at how we're going to put our news out on those platforms before we begin to think about what's going to go on the pages that you on the paper you get thrown on your doorstep every morning. And it just is sort of speaking to the new way in which people get their news and information.
This was one of the things, interestingly enough, that in that leaked New York Times innovation report that came out a few months ago, that it was perceived that there was too much of a dependence on that Page One meeting in terms of how the product came together each day and how it was moved forward. Is this going to be a cultural shift that the paper is going to accept as a whole, or is this something that you see taking some time for there to be buy-in and for it to really be put in place and move forward?
Well, I think this is something that they've probably been working on. So yes, it's going to take some time for this to happen because people are used to routines, and this is going to be a new routine. And as you go through this routine and it becomes a part of the culture, then you're going to see it. The question I have is that, is this going to continue once Dean Baquet is gone and we move on to the next editor? That will tell us whether or not this is going to be a cultural shift in the New York Times, or if it's just something that is being implemented by this particular team that may fade away if another team comes in.
I did find myself wondering if the Times is going to become dominated by the culture of now, which I think sometimes is what you see. We have very, very responsive website, mobile app, pushing of news products. Is you stop thinking about what's important in the larger scale and what do we need to do right now to attract clicks, to attract advertisers, and to get traffic moving and to bring people back.
And that's one of the things that the New York Times as a publication does best, is that its reporting brings context to stories. We even saw that in one of the clips we brought forward last week from the Page One documentary when we were talking about the loss of David Carr, but how he was calling some of those Vice executives kind of to the carpet a little bit for the contextual reporting that we tend to see, the more depth we see from the New York Times, and how this approach may shift some of that because of how news gathering goals may change as some of those cultural changes are put into effect.
Well, I know one of the things they're talking about is having more of those enterprise stories on the front page of the newspaper.
Okay.
The one that you're going to get, every
Dead
morning.
Tree edition.
Exactly. The tree.
That's what I like to call it.
The legacy edition.
We can call that. That's a little bit more politically correct than the pile of dead trees.
Right. So, I think that's what they're going to try and start shifting that to. But I also think that they need to figure out some sort of way to make sure that gets on the online as well. Because if you don't, what's going to happen is you're going to have basically what Judd is talking about, which is what's going to get the most clicks, what's going to be the news of now without the context and that wealth of information that the New York Times is known to bring to its stories.
I mean, the Times is known for doing the very important stories with the capital V, capital I, and capital P, or S. I guess very important
but
stories.
that's okay.
Yeah.
We'll call that the big J journalism. How's that? As we're talking about capital letters.
Exactly, the big J journalism.
Okay.
And you wonder if there's a story that doesn't quite hit that high enterprise level, are we still going to see that featured prominently? If it's something that's important, if it's something that's well researched, but it's not a gee whiz story, a very important story, are we going to see it on the page, or is it going to be there and then be gone 2 hours later?
Yeah, that's the problem. Is are those stories going to sort of vanish in a couple of hours, or the next time exactly that people don't get a chance to see it, and then you miss out on something that was pretty good from the New York Times.
Well, that's something we're going to have to watch for and certainly hope doesn't happen. So here's one for you. And Judd, given your time in communications working for the state, I'm really interested in your take on this. The governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, asked agency heads and staff in that state to put a disclaimer on all internal correspondences stating that it's confidential and for internal use only, protected by executive privilege. This would be kind of like the civilian equivalent of stamping it top secret. First Amendment and open government advocates say it's been done before, but only in the most extreme cases. The governor's spokesman is dismissing that email as insignificant and saying his boss is committed to having a full and complete open government. What does it say to you?
It says to me as a journalist, this is abhorrent. As a person who has to protect an institution, I think it's brilliant, because what it forces every news outlet to do is put a financial cost-benefit analysis to a story. Even
in what regard? What do you mean by that?
I think that if I say, I want these documents, and if they're stamped for internal use only executive privilege, the knee-jerk response that's going to come from the bureaucracy is, hey, we can't do it. Now you have to decide, am I going to engage my lawyer at $450 or $500 an hour for at least a couple hours to send the note saying, wait a minute, we need to get these, and you're not entitled to withhold them. So I have to decide, is this story worth $1,000 or $5,000 or $6,000? It's a fantastic tank trap.
I think what's going to happen here is that you're going to have these news organizations that are going to go after this policy. I think you're absolutely right that this is a brilliant strategy on the part of the governor's office. But I think that the way that the news media can go about this is to attack this policy and bring other governmental agencies, legislators, the judiciary, into this process to say, hey, if he's allowed to do this, then we can't get the information, which means you're not going to know what the information is either. And we need to figure out a way to stop this, and we in the media can be the ones that will be out front in fighting that battle so that all government is open.
See, and that's not all that far. I mean, it's sort of an apples and oranges thing, but this reminds me a lot of the story we were talking about not all that long ago, a few weeks ago in Indiana, where a governor had an idea to start what was basically a state-run news agency, claimed that the reporting on it wasn't exactly as he envisioned this agency coming together, but it got so much bad press that within 2 or 3 days, the entire plan was scrapped. I can't help but wonder if by the middle of next week, this whole thing in Maryland goes away too for some of those same reasons.
And I think it's going to happen mainly because you don't want to be on the side that is being seen as trying to quash information, trying to hide information from the public. And in some ways, the public is going to go, wait a minute, if the press can't get it, then we may not be able to get it either. And then that creates a negative story on the part of the governor that I'm sure he doesn't want to be a part of, especially when he's come out and said that he wants to be open and transparent about what he's doing in
having
office.
A pledge for open government.
But I think that we have plenty of politicians who have said, I want to be open and transparent, and aren't. I think that maybe the flaw in the argument you're making is that the public doesn't seem to care about openness and transparency until they have to care. So they don't care about it as much as we do in the press. And so when you look at a press office, like in Maryland or some other states, where they begin to do these somewhat draconian policies and dodges, what they're betting on is that the public doesn't care about the fights between policymakers and the press.
Well, but I also think what they're hoping is that the press will sort of back off. But as we saw in Indiana, if the press stays with it long enough, it can force forced the government's
And
hand
in that
into
case,
dropping
it
that
was
policy.
long enough, wasn't even 3 days,
That's
and it was
right,
gone,
that's
and
right.
it was walked back. Well, a few weeks ago, we spent a lot of time talking about how the media covered the anti-vaxxers controversy as the measles outbreak grew. At about the same time, the Toronto Star published an extensive investigation into the safety and efficacy of the HPV vaccine, Gardasil. It's a 3-shot series often given to teenage girls to protect against the human papillomavirus, an STD that can lead to cervical cancer. The Star's story looked at the adverse reactions dozens of Canadian teens had. Here's an excerpt from the teaser video on the paper's website.
Merck, the manufacturer of Gardasil, said health regulators in more than 130 countries have reviewed the vaccine's safety and efficacy and approved it for use. Health Canada and the US FDA say the vaccine is safe. Hundreds of thousands of teenage girls in Canada have received the vaccine's 3 doses, the vast majority without incident. The Star analyzed a Health Canada database tracking suspected side effects. We found more than 50 cases where doctors or the patients themselves suspected that the vaccine caused a serious side effect.
Among those cases is that of Annabelle Morin. Her mother, Linda, found her drowned in a bathtub in their home outside Laval, Quebec. This was just 15 days after she got her second Gardasil injection. Linda believes that Gardasil played a role in her daughter's death.
That video is on our links blog if you want to watch it in its entirety. The text story included a line that said instances like the ones described in the video hadn't been definitively linked to Gardasil. 15 days after publishing the initial investigation, editors pulled it from the website, saying that while the text story was clear, the weight of the photos, that video that you just saw an excerpt from, headlines and anecdotes could have led some to think that there was a direct connection. There's a lot that I want to talk about here, but let's get started with the idea of why the Star felt the need to pull back on this story a little bit 2 weeks after publication. What was it that made them reconsider?
I think everybody was hammering them, including the public health agencies whose data they were looking at. One of the centerpieces of this investigation was looking at an open reporting system in the United States. And the people who provided the open reporting system said, you're misinterpreting this data. You're looking at dozens of self-reported cases that haven't been epidemiologically linked back to this, and that's a very tenuous link, and it's very dangerous. And I think that public health danger argument really began to make an impact with the Star's editors.
And I think part of the problem here is going with the anecdotes, because that's the first thing that when you read in the stories, the first thing you see in the videos, and you're getting these anecdotes which make these links without necessarily having the data to back it up. And I think when that data started coming in and saying, whoa, wait a minute, you're wrong on this, is when they had to start backtracking. I mean, the anecdotal stories sound great. That's what makes the stories.
And that's what people connect with. That's what they remember. They don't remember maybe the data or some of the drier parts of it.
Exactly. But then but now you're out there on a ledge and you have nothing there to support you. And this is one of the things that happened to the newspaper.
So, Judd, I know that we often find ourselves in this position as instructors of students putting together multi-component multimedia projects where sometimes they play together very nicely, sometimes they have a tangential connection. Talk to our audience a little bit about, from your perspective, how the framing needs to happen to prevent something like this from making it to publication.
Well, this is where you need to have strong, dispassionate managers. I think that's the first thing. You need to have someone who isn't involved in the story look and go, boy, this seems like it's really doing a number on this. And I think when you don't have that, and this is not to say that the Star didn't or doesn't, it really makes it difficult to say, are we treating this as fairly as possible, or are we doing this in the most dispassionate way possible? Because we know that the anecdotes are going to have so much heavier of a weight. And the anecdotes, when we tell the stories, are so much more interesting than the data. They're so much more easier to produce than the data. They're so much more impactful. You heard the deep, menacing music in that clip.
That's one reason I don't like music in journalistic pieces. Music sets tone.
Yeah. So it's so easy to go there.
Yeah, I mean, and part of the problem with this is, I mean, we see these stories all the time, especially when we talk about car companies and the recalls and those types of things. Well, there's been some investigation into that way before you even get to the anecdotes. I mean, you have the anecdotes, but you use those to try to help you find out exactly what the facts are. In this case, what you're seeing is that the anecdotes anecdotes are driving the story, and the facts are not quite there. And you have to have that dispassion that Judd's talking about from an editor's standpoint to go back and go like, whoa, wait a minute. If all of these things were happening, why weren't there government officials or someone in the scientific community really pointing this out and saying, hey, there is an issue here. We need to pull this off the shelves. And that you didn't see that in here.
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure we touch on two more topics, and we're starting to run low on time. The first, there is a study that's floating around out there right now that says the outlook isn't so good for journalism students who are graduating this May. It comes from the Georgetown Center on Education and Workforce and looked at unemployment rates by majors for recent college grads and found that unemployment is falling for almost every major except journalism. It indicates as of right now there's an 8.2% unemployment rate for journalism majors. While other majors have higher raw numbers, those have come down, whereas in journalism it hasn't. Are we seeing this for our students? I don't seem to feel like we are.
I'm not seeing it for our students. The problem I have with the study is that it doesn't look at journalism across the board. I mean, It just may not necessarily be in a newsroom or with a public relations agency or an advertising agency. And journalism students find jobs in a lot of areas that aren't really reflected in this study. There are others out there that have been done, and plus the numbers here are from 2 years ago, so that also
we were in a different economic state.
So I don't think it necessarily reflects where we are right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a changing field. I think that if we say, hey, you're not working at a legacy newsroom organization, or it's harder to find work at a legacy newsroom organization, it's because there's fewer legacy newsroom jobs. But nonprofit organizations are employing journalists, law firms are employing journalists. I think that there's a lot of opportunity out there, so I'm not seeing this either.
Okay, well, before we do go today, I want to just take a minute to remember Dory Maynard, another legendary journalist who we found out late last night we had also lost to lung cancer. Ernest, talk to us a little bit about Dory Maynard.
Yes, she was the leader of the Maynard Institute. Her father had established that. He was the former publisher of the Oakland Tribune. One of the things about the Maynards is that they really pushed coverage of people of color, and they were one of the instrumental organizations in making sure that mainstream news organizations did great journalism and good journalism on people of color, their communities, and showed them in their authenticity as opposed to in stereotypical ways. So I think that effort is going to continue with those who are part of the Institute, but I think it's good that we acknowledge that she did a wonderful job.
She did a wonderful thing, and I think there are a lot of people remembering her fondly today. Well, we are pretty much out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics we talked about on our links blog. That's under the Programs tab at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA, and these are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, leave us comments, questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan and Maya Jackson for directing today's show, and to Pat Akers for handling the audio. Hannah Smith is our associate producer. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.